Okay, let's begin painting this cherry in watercolour. Now you can see that I've drawn the outline and I've kept it as sketch-free as possible. In other words, there aren't any sketchy lines, it's a clean, precise, concise line. And obviously this is really important for colour application. I've also drawn in roughly where the highlights are going to be. Looking at the reference photograph, they're roughly in this area, and we're going to stay out of these for the time being, although eventually we're going to paint into these little areas with a different colour, but for now we'll keep them clear. So I have in my palette mixed two colours, which are Cobalt Violet and Payne's Grey. If you don't have Cobalt Violet, then use any purple that you have mixed in with a little pink, just to give it this kind of natural, almost ultraviolet type hue. I'm going to apply this colour to begin with, as always, on the pencil line, avoiding the highlight. You can see how weak the paint is as I apply it, taking it right up to the edge of the pencil. As I'm applying the paint, you will notice that this side of the paint will dry. Because we're taking the paint everywhere, in this instance, it won't matter if we have a slight overlap, so don't worry too much about that now. Just apply it right up to the pencil edge. And as I said, keep out of the highlights. When you arrive at the area of this little highlight, make sure that you give yourself enough leeway to paint into the highlight. In other words, you don't want to take the paint right up to the edge here, because you won't have any area to blend the paint into the paper. You need to keep it as big as possible so that you have some room for leeway a bit later on when you come to mix your darker colours. But for now, just focus on painting around this pencil line really slowly and really carefully, taking care to stay inside the pencil line itself. If you are using Cobalt Violet, you may find that you need to keep mixing your paint within your palette, because it is a granulating colour and it can have a tendency to separate, but that just means you just mix it up as you go along. So as you can see, I'm carefully applying the colour as close as I can. Now that I've got these hard edges here, I'm just going to pick up some more pigment, and by going over that, we can blend that in really, really easily. As you can see, it's looking a little patchy at the moment, but that's not a problem. We can blend those colours together as we go through. Now, as I said, this is our template wash. In other words, as we work through this tutorial, we will blend the colours over each other as we work through. The template meaning that we can change the colours. They may not be correct, and they certainly won't be the correct level of strength of colour, but it's just showing us where we're going to go a bit later on, and we won't have to worry about getting that particular tone in place because we already know where to go. This will make more sense as we go through the tutorial. Now, I've applied this colour everywhere shown apart from the highlights, as I've said earlier on. Now you can see where this highlight is. I've got quite a hard edge here, which we don't want. So just soften your edge by dampening your brush in a little clear water, and by using the wiggle technique that I've shown you in a previous tutorial, you can just manipulate the paint on the paper to soften that edge out. And you can do this a few times just to blur the edges into itself, using the paper as a palette. So now that that's softened and all the edges are blurred, we have our template in place, and we can build on this as we work through. Any rough edges can be blended in at this point using the tip of your brush just to soften them through, and just pull them towards the pencil line if they've already retracted back in on itself, as watercolour often does. So that's our template wash. So now that we have the initial wash in place, we can start to think about the colours that we're going to use to build up form and depth, and that really vibrant red at the end. So the next thing we need to do is mix up the darker tone to a lighter consistency. In other words, what we're going to do is still put the template in place so that we can build on it later. Now what this does is it means that you can apply your colour without being too nervous about it. So if you were to put your really dark colour in next and you put it on incorrectly, you're going to become stuck. But if you put it on in a lighter layer which guides you as to what to do next, then it's a winner. Let's start to mix some colours. I'm just applying some water onto my palette with a pipette just to make it a bit easier. Now the first colour I'm going to use is Perylene Violet. This particular one is made by Winsor & Newton. So as I said, at this point we need it to be very watery because it's just part of our template on which we will build both colour and form later. It's just to guide us. I'm also going to do a puddle of crimson. This is by Daniel Smith, but you can use any crimson that you have. Just looking at the reference photograph, you'll see that it has got crimson tones in there somewhere, and we can adjust it later by putting glazes of other colours on top. I think that's probably about the right consistency. If in doubt, add more water. It's far better to have it weaker than you need rather than have it too strong and apply the wrong colour later on. So looking carefully at the reference photograph, I have on my brush the mix of crimson, and you can see where I'm applying it and just blending it into the existing paint, cleaning my brush as I go along. It's really important that you keep looking at your reference photograph to see exactly which colour goes where. Okay, and also working around the highlight. Because I have the petal of Perylene on my palette, I'm picking that up now and I'm working around the obvious colours. Now when you reach the highlight here, don't take the paint right up to the pencil line because you won't have anywhere to blend it to. So take it to that part, clean your brush, dampen it on the kitchen towel and just blend it in like so, using sort of wiggly motions like that. And that gives a soft edge around the highlight where it will eventually become more blurred. We'll probably wash over it with something towards the end, but for now it's important that we have these tones and colours in place to guide us. And you can see I'm just pulling the paint as I go to where it is needed. Don't worry too much about any patchy areas at this point because we can paint over them later. Now keep looking at your reference photograph and see where the redder tone of the two is. And also remember to keep out of this disappearing edge here. We can blend the colour into that as we go along. Now remember, I've kept a bit of a boundary here so that I have the leeway to blend it in. Okay, it's really important to keep these little features where they are to give it a realism. And again, I'm just cleaning my brush as I go, making sure that there isn't any pigment on it, and then dampening it, patting it on the kitchen towel, and just blending it into itself. If you are worried about patchy areas, then you can go over the entire thing a little bit later with a plain water glaze. Now taking care when we apply the paint around the highlight, we can take the Perylene right to the edge here, because as you can see on this right hand side of the cherry, it's a very dark colour, so we're quite safe to put the paint here anyway. So right up to the pencil edge, working as far away from the highlight as you can so that we have that leeway once again to blend it in. We want the highlight to look really natural and organic without any hard edges as it does in the photograph. And it's always better to go wider at this point rather than right up to the edge and not have anywhere to blend it to. Take another look at your reference photograph and I can see that although we have the disappearing edge here, it still has some pigment within it. We can sort that out a bit later. Keep it there for the time being. And blend it the whole time. And a little bit of colour up here. Although there is an element of disappearing edge where the cherry blends into the paper, we still need to cover it with something. So I'm going to use probably a mixture of the two colours at this point, and work around the highlight a little bit and just blend that in like so, and another little bit of the crimson colour around here. It's still very, very watery, so nothing to be worried about. If you make a mistake at this point, it really doesn't matter. So again, just going over the bits that I've done, using the tip of the brush to get right up to that pencil edge to keep it nice and neat. And there's probably a little bit around the stalk area as well, but take great care to keep away from those highlights. Now it's looking very messy at the moment. This is absolutely normal. So don't be put off on thinking that you've made a mistake at this point. This is how it is supposed to look. Just keep blending, keeping out of the areas you know you have to keep out of. And if you do accidentally go into it, we can lift it out later using a flat brush, and I will show you how later on in this tutorial. So just blending it in and around the highlights. I'm going to continue doing this, and then we'll go to the next step.